All right, great. So today's class is I had a choice of discussing some of the essays, but I thought I will talk about one aspect of writing the essays, and I've read your third submission, some of you, not all of you, and I've noticed something that is it's kind of difficult to discuss, but I hope we can kind of make it. Okay, so I prepared three use cases, two which are four actually. Two which are not from the essays and two which are from the essays. Okay, so imagine that you're reading something about programming languages. Okay, that's kind of a domain which is familiar to you, and someone writes that C++ is the main object-oriented programming language that is the most widely used in the industry. Okay? What would be okay and what would be wrong with that statement? So we read that C++ is the most widely used. Okay? And then is object-oriented. And so let's say it's in industry. So what's wrong? Or what's okay?
Well, it is object-oriented, or that's not the, it's not just that it's
Yeah.
operates. So,
TMS?
I don't agree that it's object-oriented, but that's not the biggest problem, I would say.
Yeah.
I would say the biggest problem is that industry isn't defined at all.
Yeah.
Like what industry?
Yes.
Saying that this is most widely used.
Yes. Great. Right. So we already see three weak things, right? The definition, like how would you provide evidence that it's most widely used? Okay. So how would you provide evidence for that? What does it mean in the industry? What sort of industry? Like software industry in general? Like for which domains? Like what are we talking about here? And is C++ really object-oriented? Right? What is the definition of object orientation? How would you define a language to be object-oriented? Right? This is probably the biggest problem, right? Because this is problematic, but we can agree on some sort of definition. Okay, in general software industry, or how can we calculate most widely used? Can we use some Stack Overflow statistics or whatever, right? We can kind of operationalize this and this somehow. Later in the text, the author may operationalize it, right? But if someone is claiming that C++ is object-oriented, it's already kind of indicating a particular perspective of what object orientation is. And that's really difficult to operationalize. It's kind of fundamentally C++ is not object-oriented. Because what would make, so even if we discard those two statements, what would make you believe the author more? So instead of reading this, what would convince you that the author knows what he or she is talking about if they say object orientation? Yeah?
They supply a definition.
They would have to supply a definition, exactly. They would have to explain what they mean by object orientation, right? Then it may or may not hold, right? And then the other things are weak as well, but the other ones are a little bit easier to swallow because most academics kind of do some mental jumps, right? We say nowadays mobile gaming is taking over the PC and console gaming. Okay, do we really have evidence for that? Well, maybe we do, maybe we not. But we do sometimes say statements like that, and it's okay, right? I mean, it's not okay, but it's acceptable to a point that you still have this believable relationship to the author. Okay, if they do this, you still don't think they don't know what they're talking about. But if they do this, you really start questioning them. Okay. So that's one example. The example here was about object orientation. Why is C++ not really object oriented? Well, we can spend the entire lecture on it, but it has to do with terms like reification, right? Reification, reflection. Do C++ has type reflection? No, it's a compiled type language. So some people say those things are needed for object orientation, right? So C++ has some properties of object-oriented language, but it is not strictly speaking object-oriented. But
that you're not forced into a paradigm, so it wouldn't make sense even if those were the cases, because it has all the other features as well.
Yeah, that's right. The problem here is that if you Google C++, it will always come up that C++ is object-oriented, right? So the common understanding of what C++ is, it is an example of object-oriented language, right? And it's really not, okay? So another simple one. You read a statement that that was actually yesterday with discussing with Christopher. So you read a statement saying Simic is a modern build system. Blah, 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 right? What's wrong with that statement? Well, you may ask, what's bothered? Okay, it's a weak thing, but we do accept it. Like, we don't discard the author knowledge if they use something like this, okay? They say they're a bit sloppy. They should be more precise what they mean, right? But what's more of a problem here? Is CMake really a build system? Exactly. Exactly, right? So what is a build system? Again,
It's not a compiler, so...
It's not a compiler, right? But if you think about the build system, what are the components of the build system? So you have some sort of a project, right? So you have a project, and usually you have so let's say the project is composed of what? So you have a project, and what's part of the project? Well, you have to have some sources, right? You have to have some resources. And then you need what? You need some sort of definitions or some declarations of how to build the system, right? So how to go from this, there is some process here, into executables, or libraries, or binaries, right? So at the end of the build process, we end up with this, right? This, we typically say, this is a build system. Build system, right? And this is part of the project, right? We can discuss whether this part is really part of the project or whether this is part of the build system, okay? So let's, for the sake of discussion, kind of extract that part and put it as part of the build system, okay? So if we kind of dissect what build system is, we will say, okay, the build system has one part which is some sort of declarations or definitions or specifications of how to do the build, and then the second part is the part which kind of does the build, the kind of the executable kind of thing that interprets that and actually does the build, right? And doing the build, again, has two components. One is kind of interpreting that bit. The other one is actually compiling and building stuff, right? So the compilers and linkers and all those things are part of this part of the build system. And this, you could say, okay, it's sort of a part of it, but you could say it's separate, right? So now, where does Simic fits into that picture? So is make a build system? Is not so modern build system, right? I have those two sentences. What's the difference? Is make a build system? Yes. Why is make a build system?
Define the rules of.
It contains this, and it can do this. It interacts with it doesn't have compilers built in. It interacts with the operating system compilers, but it does those two things, right? It actually executes the declarations. Is Simic doing the same? No, Simic is only that, right? It generates a make file or a Visual Studio project file, whatever, and it needs that component to actually execute the build, right? So technically, Simic is not a build system. Simic is a declaration definition generator for a particular build system. And that particular build system could be Make, could be Visual Studio, could be Xcode, and so on, right? I can generate an Xcode definitions, and then Xcode will actually do the build for me. Or I can generate Visual Studio project file, and the Visual Studio will do the build for me. Or I can generate Make files, and then Make will do the build for me. But Simic itself doesn't have that part, so technically it's not a build system, right? Okay, so those two examples highlight a pattern. What is the pattern? So if we read something, it's similar with the code. If we read something that smells, it feels a little bit imprecise or a little bit wrong, what happens? We lose the trust in the author arguments, right? We start questioning, is he really right, or is he just making or she making things up, right? So one important thing here is the trust, right? Trust between the reader and the writer, okay? The second thing is we have to be precise, but we also have to go a little bit deeper than Googling it, okay? So if I go to Google and I Google Simic, oops. Let's say I go to this definition. So it says Simic is a cross-platform, free and open source software for managing the build process of software using a compiler-independent method, right? How would you interpret it? Well, you can interpret it that it is a build system, or you could interpret it that it's part of a build system, right? If you don't read properly the full definition, just reading that first sentence may give you a kind of a wrong impression. But you know what you're talking about and you know what it is, right? So when someone shortcuts it and says Simic is a build system, then you say, actually, it's not really a build system in itself, right? If you go deeper, if you actually read the definition, so let's make it a little bit smaller. So Simic can handle in-place and out-of-place builds, enabling several builds from the same source and cross-compilation, blah, blah, blah. It kind of looks like it's a proper build system, but then you read here is like the build process with Simic takes place in two stages. First, standard build files are created from configuration files then platform's native build tools are used to the actual building, right? So it means Simic cannot actually do the building. It's someone else, something else doing the actual building. So can you call something that cannot do the build, a build system? Well, no, you can't, right? So, but again, it requires kind of going a little bit deeper into what a single simple Google gives you, right? So if you just stop here, we get kind of a shallow understanding of something, and you sort of I don't know how to call it. It's kind of a lack of depth. Okay. So the lack of depth leads to the lack of trust, right? The depth leads to more trust. If you demonstratively went deeper into the topic, then you build this kind of relationship of being authoritative about the topic, right? If you said Simic is a build system, well, like someone knowledgeable will kind of not trust you anymore. But if you say, Simic is part of the build system because it uses platform-dependent backends, it's not a big deal. I mean, it's like one extra statement. But suddenly you like way up here, right? You become an expert, right? So in your own writing, you really have to think what is this sort of a very shallow take on a topic and what's not. And for topics that you're not very familiar with, it's super hard, right? So with C++ and with CMakes, it's easy because you already know it. You're already an expert, right? But let's say we talk about AI, or we talk about machine learning, or we talk about areas where you're just learning to, you're diving deeper into it. Then, how would you recognize that you at the shallow level, or how would you recognize that you kind of at the depths of something? It's hard. Sometimes you can do that, sometimes you can't. So, if we take a topic completely out of your expert area, right? How would you recognize that you're not exploring the depths of that topic, typically? Yeah?
What does the marketers use as terms? I would guess just saying machine learning now wouldn't really net any.
Yeah. So one is are the terms used by marketers, right? What is AI? Well, AI is the term used by marketers. And when they say AI, they mean 1,000 different things, right? What do you mean by saying AI, right? Okay, so good. So that's a really good point, okay? If the terms are used by marketers, then what happens? Well, you have to provide a definition. What do you mean by it, right? If the term object orientation is misused by different people meaning different things, and you cannot use it, you have to say, what do you mean by OO, right? So if you recognize that the term is being used by marketers, what you have to do, you have to provide definition. Okay. What else? How else can you recognize that you are not there yet? So following from that, let's say you've done a Google search on something, right? Let's say, I don't know, let's talk about like a neuroscience, okay? We're talking about some sort of a phenomena in neuroscience. You know the phenomena name, you Googled it, and you get some keywords, right? And then you find an article which uses 5 different keywords that you didn't know. Then you know you didn't know now the extra things, right? So if you're doing your search and you're doing your reading and you're coming up and you're reading terms that you don't know, that you have to look up what they mean, that means you haven't reached the depth yet, right? So unknown terms, right? So you're researching an area, and then you see, oh yeah, that's the term I don't know, and you dive into that term. You try to understand it, right? So let's say PMS is doing research on transactional memory systems, right? And he reads terms like memory barriers, synchronizations, and all those things, right? You already know all those terms, right? So when you're reading about memory management now, most of the terms are clear to you, which means you're probably pretty good at that topic already, right? If you're reading stuff and you understand all the terms, that means you became kind of an expert in that niche, in that area. But if someone else is reading about memory management and they have, you know, spin locks, synchronizations, barriers, different terms which they have to look up, that means, okay, there is space for you to explore more, right? So having unknown terms means you haven't reached the point yet. What's the solution? Well, you know, learn the terms, right? So you have to understand all the terms, right? All the relevant terminology, right? Okay.
Ages. That will take us next to 3 years of looking into the topic.
Yes, that's true. So we will we will discuss that a little bit later. So you cannot fully do that. You cannot be an expert in everything, right? It's impossible. What is important though is like understanding your limits, right? Not making claims in the area that you don't have the authority to make claims, right? So when you so for your master thesis, you will be using a particular domain, right? And in that domain, you have to do this. If you don't do that, it will show in your writing, right? But for the auxiliary areas, you cannot do that. So what you do, you delegate the authority to somebody else. So you say, that was the authority in that area, I'm using what they say. I don't say it myself, I'm just using it, right? Which leads us to the third one. Key people, right? Okay, so let's say you read about VR, and someone writes about VR and says, Facebook did that. Facebook has an Oculus, right? What's wrong with that? So someone says something blah 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 about the Oculus headset, and someone writes that it was done by Facebook. So what's wrong with that? Yeah?
I mean, Facebook owns Oculus, but it's not them who are developing it.
Exactly. The first thing that is wrong is technically it's true that Facebook owns Oculus now. But when Oculus actually started, it wasn't owned by Facebook. It was bought by Facebook later, right? Who owned Oculus initially? It was a Kickstarter campaign and it was owned by Oculus itself. Like Oculus was the company which was behind Oculus, right? So Oculus was self-owned, right? But if we say Oculus invented something, or Oculus pioneered something, was it really Oculus? What is Oculus?
Bunch of people.
Who?
Potentially, well, it was the Kickstarter. I don't know when John Carmack.
Exactly. So John Carmack is the name, right? If you don't mention him for some innovation about the headsets, then you're completely missing the point, right? You have to know the history and you need to know the name, right? So key person doing the innovation with the modern headsets was John Carmack. What he did? Well, he kind of did a clever thing with the mobile displays to demonstrate that you can use them for doing VR, right? On a very cheap hardware, right? Before it was done on specialized hardware and it was much more expensive and much more difficult. He did kind of a software treat by showcasing that you can use relatively low-powered devices and commodity screens to achieve the same effects, right? Again, depth, well, you have to go into, be precise what it means, and don't use companies. Companies don't invent shit. People invent shit, right? If you say Apple invented something, then okay, I don't care what you say anymore, right? you don't know what you're talking about. Apple never invents anything. It's people inventing things, right? You have to know who invented something and what it was, right? So you have to attribute things to people. You should not attribute things to companies. Yes, companies demonstrate particular instantiation of innovation, right? So yes, companies build prototypes and they build things, but they don't really innovate in the conceptual space. They innovate in the kind of building space, right? Yeah?
How to deal with the case where that isn't a no? Because I mean, I guess one way you could do it is because if people aren't going around holding conferences talking about the stuff they've invented, and the company seizes the ownership of the idea, which is completely possible, then how do you go sort of through that?
That's a very valid point. Okay,
because
so
in that case, to everyone except like the people on the except the people who sort of are colleagues to that person are the only ones who know who might have done it. And also, how do you deal with team efforts? Because saying it's just one person, there are many cases where there is a team that's coming up with a solution, not one person.
that's true. So okay, so let's say here is the kind of people space where people kind of innovate with the ideas, okay? And you have, different kind of things happening here, and it's mostly idea, and you have papers, you have talks, but it's kind of the idea space, right? And then you have something in between. And then you have companies commercializing and building things, right? So here usually you have companies. So same as, when we talk about modern VR, it kind of boils down to John Cormack doing the initial work, right? That's his name. He did all Oculus stuff? No, he didn't. It was a team effort, right? So if you talk about particular device, right, then you can attribute it to the Oculus as a company or Oculus as a team. But if you're talking about a particular idea, you have to sort of go down to the person level, right? How many things happen here, and how many things happen here? Well, it kind of depends what we're talking about, right? So let's, like I had an example with the SQL databases, right? Let's say you want to explain kind of a modern ideas about SQL databases. Would you mention MySQL? It's one of the most widely used, SQL example, right? You could mention it, right? But you have to do it in a context, right? So would you mention Oracle? Would you say MySQL innovated something or Oracle innovated something? Yes, you could, but they did on a very technical, very detailed level kind of here. But some fundamental principles, some fundamental aspects of it that you want to explore are kind of still done on the human level, right? And to give you kind of yeah, so there was this one was quite good. So it basically kind of goes over the history of the developments, right? So the development started, as soon as the computer started. The first databases started in the 60s, and then we have those two systems, and then we have this guy, Code, right? Have you heard about him? Yeah, so he's like the godfather or grandfather of the modern relational algebras, right? But he wasn't the inventor of those algebras. He was the one who published about them in like 1970, but the algebras mathematically were before him. Mathematicians were discussing it even before he published his work, right? So then this guy publishes this important paper, and then the SQL kind of starts, right? the original paper wasn't actually exactly the same as the SQL standards now. It was different. So then you have some forks. So he publishes it in 70s, and then you have those two main systems being created between 74 and 77, right? And then the modern era of databases starts, right? So if you go to MySQL, MySQL first release 95, right? It's ages after what actually important developments happened, right? So do you really need to mention MySQL? Not really. Like it was kind of an afterthought of all the important things which happened before, right? So often that's what happens. Often the company is kind of taking credit or saying, okay, we just invented something or it's a new thing, boils down to work which happened like 10 years ago by people, right? I'm not saying that's the case for everything, but that's often the case, right? So often you don't need to attribute it here. You can kind of drill it down to the particular concept or idea that you can attribute to a human. Yes, there are examples like, you want to describe Google Glass, okay? Is the idea new? Well, the Google Glass itself is relatively new, okay? And you can attribute it to Google. You don't know exactly who came up with that particular design and particular setup with the camera and so on, right? But if you're talking about augmented reality and kind of a see-through, then that's not Google, that's way back, right? And you can go down to the conceptual level, right? So it depends what you're exploring, what you're focusing on. And if you're focusing on particular improvements or optimizations of relational databases, then maybe you have to mention MySQL because these were the guys who did first implemented something like this. But if you're talking about databases in general, then you weigh, it depends on the context, right? If you're really discussing something that has been done by the team and it makes sense to attribute it to a team or to a company, sure, you do it, right? But more often than not, that's not appropriate, right? And I have so attributing VR to Facebook or Oculus, no, you didn't do your homework. You really have to attribute it to people, right? Attributing augmented reality to Microsoft, HoloLens, again, you haven't really done your homework, right? That's marketing people talk, right? You have to go down to the exact ideas or exact instantiations. And usually you can find people who are behind it, right? Okay, so, and then, relational algebra started even earlier than the 70. Okay, so those were examples not from the essays. Now kind of examples from the essays. So,
Just have a follow-up.
yeah.
Where do you stop?
Use your judgment, right?
Because John Carmack is attributed for the past big
Yes.
thing, but
he was not.
He was not the original.
That's true, exactly. So it depends on the context of what exactly you want to highlight or what exactly you're talking about, right? Again, it boils down to being precise and kind of going with the definitions, right? If you have the basis, which you can argue on top of, that's where you stop, right? But the basis has to be relatively solid. So your basis cannot be based on kind of a marketing jargon, right? So for your basis, you have to kind of go to some solid foundations, right? So if you're talking about VR, like modern VR with the modern headsets and you want to identify the key kind of breakthrough, then Cormac is the breakthrough, right? But if you're talking about VR in general, then you have to go, elsewhere. You have to go wider and deeper. Is it hard? Sure, it's hard. Is it time consuming? Sure, it's time consuming. Going with all those readings and learning things, that's what being academic is about, right? So just reading Google and reading stuff which is easily accessible is not enough. It will show that you just touched the surface, okay? Okay, so example from the essay. So, a sentence. one of the most, let's say, a good example of augmented reality is game Pokemon Go. Okay, and then we Google Pokemon Go. And augmented reality, it's even there, you know, on the first thing, right? It's everywhere, right? Pokemon Go is an augmented reality game. But is Pokemon Go really an augmented reality game? What is augmented reality?
It's expanding reality with extra information or elements. So
Yeah, it is. I would agree with that definition. So, did you play Pokemon Go? Did you play it without the augmented reality mode?
yeah, because they are shits.
Exactly. Me too, right? So if you turn it off, you don't need it, right? So is Pokemon Go really an augmented reality game? No, it's not. By no definitions, like reasonable definitions, Pokemon Go is not an example of augmented reality game. It has a feature where they place something in the real world, a very shitty way, but you don't really need to use that feature for the game, right? So why would you say that Pokemon Go is an augmented reality game? Why would you say that? You wouldn't, yeah?
Does that sort of apply to everything? So the 3DS is not a 3D console?
Which one?
The Nintendo 3DS is not a 3D console because you can't play with the 3D off.
Yeah.
Then everything breaks down.
Some things break down, not
Most
everything.
things break down.
No,
Pretty much.
I don't think so. So sometimes, I mean, the augmented reality in Pokemon Go is so shit that giving it as an example of augmented reality is really pushing the definition of what augmented reality is, okay? I wouldn't do that. Like, to me, augmented reality is about augmenting the reality, about the tracking, about the filters that you use, about the, you know, the quality of placement of the objects, right? If you just randomly place something on the see-through, is that really augmented reality? Well, you can say it's kind of technically it is, but it's kind of an example of very low entry augmented reality system, right? It's not really what augmented reality is about. If I have see-through and I just have very randomly placed objects in the view, which kind of drift and don't, you know, yes, technically, okay, it is. So if I put you know, glasses which have a sticker on it, and I can see that sticker in the world, is it augmented reality? Yes, technically it is, but I would rather use a different definition, right? Yeah.
So if you say that, so just a little bit back on to me, so the fact that you can turn off the functionality is not that it will not be an example, but it's rather the quality of what it potentially can deliver as a VR and AR.
I would say so, yes, I would say so. So the bare reason that you can turn off the 3D is not really a reason to discredit it that it's not 3D. It can be used as an example of a 3D game or whatever it is, right? But if it's a really,
It's a gimmick.
if it's just a gimmick, exactly, you know. So the same was with the what's that company? Snapchat filters, right? Are Snapchat filters really kind of a good example of augmented reality? Yeah, maybe. You know, if they are actually doing some form of tracking, like I think if you have a purely location-based augmented reality, it would fall out of my definition of augmented reality. I would call it location-based, right? Is Pokemon Go a location-based game? Sure it is. By all definitions of location-based, it is a location-based game. But it's not augmented reality-based game, right? the phone doesn't know what reality is around it. It knows location, but it doesn't know the reality around it. If you're not doing the tracking, you're not doing AR. You're doing location-based. So I would distinguish location-based AR from the true AR, right? Okay, so that's a bit of a rant about Pokemon Go, but the thing was to highlight that some things that are kind of very common and commonly used by marketing departments are not very useful often to make an argument, right? And when you start writing like this, when your kind of introduction is about Pokemon Go and Snapchat being examples of AR, then I know you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what AR is, right? You could use it, but then you have to, you have to go into the details and into the definitions and, exactly what does it mean, right? What do you want to explain? If you just say this sentence, then I really lose trust in what you know, right? And I think you don't know what you don't know as well, right? So not knowing something is okay as long as you communicate it to the reader that some things you're not an expert in and you're just using somebody else's opinions on it, right? But don't use marketers' opinions on it. Use somebody else's research opinions on it, right? So if you say location-based, so again, you have some things about being location-based, and if you kind of go a little bit into the research papers, they will usually talk about like kind of a location-based games, and that is kind of a good example of a location-based game. Okay, so yes, so augmented reality. So what are the dangerous terms? VR and AR mean a lot of different things to different people, right? AI, right? Machine learning. This one is not as bad as those, right?
It will be though.
Well, yeah, exactly. So you have to be kind of aware when you write what are the kind of a dangerous territory kind of used by the marketers, and sort of either try to avoid it or try to specify what do you mean, right?
But so the whole talk of losing trust and being precise, etc.
Yeah.
How much should the reader disregard based on that? Because so for instance, say that you're doing programming languages, and let's take for instance Jonathan Blow. He's making his own language. He's constantly being criticized for not sort of going or retreading the sort of past apparently that other programming language researchers has done.
Yeah.
However, his ideas, like if they've been tried before, like even though they've been tried before, that doesn't mean that they aren't necessarily valid now or better fit sort of the working conditions of, for instance, the game industry, which is where he is specializing. But still, the fact that he hasn't necessarily gone that deep or rethreading guns means that a lot of people just disregard it. So we get into the same problems when people say that having spelling mistakes sort of instantly disqualifies your argument. That's bullshit, because what you're saying can still be important and valid.
Yes. So that's so I don't have the answer to that problem. Okay.
So it's pretty elitist.
It is exactly. So traditionally, traditionally what happened was we have this ivory tower of academia, right? So we have this, academics here, and they were doing the proper thing and very thorough and blah blah blah, right? In depth and everything that is like marketing is discredited, okay? And then you had the kind of a normal people, which were not doing science. They were not doing this sort of pushing of the frontiers of ideas, right? And there was kind of a gap here because you could clearly see the marketers and the business talk, and you could see the academic research, right? What happens in the last 20 years or so, that gap kind of disappeared, right? So you basically have now very sloppy academics, right, who write and publish a lot of not so high quality materials, and you have normal people who are doing almost the academic stuff, but without this extra effort to cite and to be based on others people's work. Is his work not worth? Yes, I mean, his quality is probably somewhere here. It's better than some of the academic publishing, right? But it's not here, right? He's not pushing it to the to be, as you say, like to cite previous work and kind of build on top of it, right? And I don't know, like I honestly think his approach is actually good, and that's what I did myself by doing some creative thinking first and tinkering first, and then checking what other people did. Because if you do the checking first, it will limit your conceptual perception of what is and what is not possible, or how to use something, right? So I think the model is actually perfectly fine for doing some work without doing a thorough research on what everybody else has done in that field, right? So let's say I want to do something with evolutionary computing, and I have some sort of a toy system that I've built. I can explore it. I can kind of put creative effort into it and explore it, even though I might be reinventing the wheel, right? But I might reinvent the wheel in a slightly different way, right? But usually for academics, what happens is at some point once you have it, you kind of go back and you try to map it to see where your work came from. Even though you were not based on somebody else's work, you try to bring what they've discovered, what limitations they have, and so on, and make your work even better, right? But you don't have to start here. You can start on your own. So when he's doing what he's doing, that's great. But at some point, either him or somebody else will make this synthesis and build something which is taking best of everything, right? So he's contributing for sure. His work would be better if he was aware of work done before, right? Because then he could benefit from that knowledge. If he's kind of reinventing certain things anew, afresh, sometimes it's great. Sometimes it's like waste of time because we know some things don't work. Like it looked like a good idea, initially, but then it was shown, okay, it has those side effects or whatever it is, right? So there is no single model that works. And where do you stop? I mean, if you're an academic, you have to do this check at the end, because that's sort of the part of the process. If you stop before doing that check of where your work sits and where your work draws from, that's fine. It happened in a lot of times in history as well. Like people invented something that has been invented a few years back, and they kind of reinvented it. They were not aware of it, and they kind of reinvented it, right? Is it a mistake? Well, no, it's just part of the process, right? But if something is known for the last 20 years about programming languages, and he's now kind of redoing it, yes, as I say, it has benefits, but it has disadvantages as well, right? He would do a more high-quality work if he was aware of the problems or benefits of some things, right, in that particular domain. Okay, any other questions? So I'm not sure if I communicated what I wanted to communicate, right? There are some highlights. So the most important one is the lack of trust, right? So we call them like alarm bells or something. You read something, it's like, oh, it starts to smell, okay? So the reviewers of your work, of your master thesis, will be the same. If you write something in a very broad terms, which are kind of a marketing terminology without providing kind of precise, in-depth definitions, they will say, okay, that's a C, D student, or maybe fail, right? They will not think of you as an A student, for sure, right? So if you have aspirations to kind of do a better job in your writing, you have to try to avoid it. Try to avoid statements that are very vague. And it's, as I was explaining with the first one, if you say something is widely used, that's kind of bad, but it's not, D-level bad. You can still get A with some statements like that, right? But if you say Pokemon Go is an AR example for a reviewer who is an AR expert, they will say, yeah, you don't know what you're talking about. It's a very shallow take on the topic, right? That's C or D or worse, right? So you have to be paying attention to, to what you don't know first. So you have to identify how an expert you are in the field, how authoritative you are, right? If you feel the topic is out of your depths, that's fine. We cannot be experts in everything. You just acknowledge it. You say this is beyond the scope of this thesis or beyond the discussion, and you say I'm using kind of results of somebody else's as a basis, as an assumption, and that's fine. But for your own work, for the work that you're contributing to, you have to kind of drill down. You have to get to the depths. You have to get to this essence of what you're exploring, what you're researching. Because without it, that's not good enough. And a lot of master theses, a lot of master students, they try to cover a lot of ground, like wide-wise, right? So they cover VR and AR and glasses and headsets and cameras and everything, right? Because the more the better, the more of an expert I am. No, right? That's not how it works. You can say, okay, I'm working within a particular broader field, but then you have to narrow it down and scope it down to exactly what is that you're working with, what is that you're solving or exploring, right? So when you're writing about AR and you want to give examples, kind of think exactly what I'm talking about. What is it about AR that I want to explore, right? Is it the quality of the augmentation? Is it the use cases for the augmentation? Is it the user benefits from the augmentation? What is it? AR itself is a huge topic, right? You have to pick something. And then it's easier to write it kind of in depth because once you picked something, you kind of drill it a little bit deeper. Use the proper terms. So if you have yes, so when you use terms, when you use an acronym, always define what the acronym means, right? That's sort of simple. But how, should you use a term that everybody knows without defining what it is? It depends. So, so do you know what SLAM is? In the context of computer vision. So if I go so that's the expanded acronym, right? So this in itself is a research area, right? So let's say you're talking about AR and VR, and you want to talk about this sort of use cases where you can, because the device typically knows where it is, because it has to do the sensing and kind of a projecting. You can do SLAM on the device as well and kind of build a map of the environment. So like we had a project, for example, 2 years ago where you've used a portable device that was the Google Tango device, who can do the depth sensing and kind of localization. So when you start, it kind of calibrates itself, so it knows where it is in the room, and then you can go out of the room, and then while you're walking, it can build the model of the environment. And if you have multiple users going on the corridors and on the different rooms, you can actually map of where things are in space without knowing it a priori, right? So then you would use SLAM. So when you're using a term like that, it's not enough just to use the acronym. You have to first expand the acronym and also then discuss what you mean by that particular technique in the context of the arguments that you're making, right? It is for very obvious things. You don't have to do it. For things that are a bit dangerous, you have to do it because then it narrows down the definition. And for things that you just want to demonstrate that you understand what you're talking about, you should do that as well, right? So in your thesis, every time you're using kind of a more technical term, usually you introduce that term in the writing. And it depends how general it is. If it's a very general, like SLAM, you can introduce it very briefly. But if it's kind of a particular, if you really dive into like how the Kalman filters or extended Kalman filters work, then you have to kind of demonstrate more in depth of the understanding and convey that understanding to the reader, right? So your reviewers will be computer scientists, but they may not be experts in everything, right? So then for them, you have to sort of build this base. So in this particular case, you should define what SLAM is, expand the acronym, and kind of say what is it for, right? Okay. So that's it. Any questions? Did I manage to sort of convey what I wanted? So to improve the quality of your writing, try to avoid generalizations, try to be precise, and try not to demonstrate the lack of depth, right? Sometimes it's okay, as we were explaining, if you say it's widely used. Yeah, okay. But Simic is a build system, or Pokemon Go is an augmented reality game. That's much more painful for the reader who is an expert, right? Try not to do that. Well, will you know if you're making those mistakes or not? Sometimes you will not, right? Especially if it's outside of your really kind of expertise area. So then try to kind of ask yourself, are those terms used by the marketers? Yes, they are. Okay, I should reread what I wrote, right? Do I have in the area terms that I'm not familiar with? Yes, I do. Then you have to read those terms, learn about those terms. Can I identify the key people and key innovations and key things that happen in that area? No, I can't. Then I am not an expert. Then I probably should not make any claims. I should delegate all the claims to somebody else, right? With this famous Pokemon Go sentence, right? So if you say Pokemon Go is a widely loved example of augmented reality game, right? Right? You burn yourself, right? Like you burn the trust with the reader. But imagine what you say. According to this and this and this, and you cite some researchers, right? They would have to be research publications, right? Pokemon Go is a good example of augmented reality game, right? Did you burn the trust? Well, a little bit, but not as bad, right? So if I go to Google Scholar, so let's say we do this, and I try Pokemon Go augmented reality. Well, I don't know whether you can find papers saying that Pokemon Go is augmented reality game, right? Yeah, exactly. So you could use that, right? So you could say, according to those Finnish or Swedish guys, Pokemon Go is augmented reality game, right? And then, I mean, you're using it as an argument for something, right? And then it turns out the assumption is kind of not true, but it's not your fault, it's these guys' fault, right? So you sort of delegated the responsibility to somebody else, right? And then if the reviewer in the defense asks you, is Pokemon Go really an augmented reality game? You may say, actually, I don't know. Like, I'm not an expert. I think it might be, but I sort of used somebody else's research, right? And then you sort of offload the responsibility for taking the responsibility for the claim to somebody else's, right? So if you can do that, do that. Because if you say Pokemon Go is an augmented reality game, you have to provide me evidence why. Why do you think that, right? So you can sometimes kind of maneuver an area that you're not an expert in into delegating the claim to somebody else, and that's fine. Okay. Any questions? Yes? Mm-hmm.
I found that I read so many definitions for because I wanted to write about the public key infrastructure.
Yeah.
But I know already so many different definitions of public key infrastructure that I was able to actually write my own definition,
Mm-hmm.
which I believe is based on those old definitions which I already read. But can I trust myself and just write my definition, or should I anyway find another definition and point to some definition which I found in some paper, which for example, for me, this definition is not enough.
Yeah. So you can write your own, and then you can use your own as a basis, right? And then if you are being asked why do you have this particular definition, you can point out to the other ones saying, oh, I was inspired or I used parts of the other ones, but with those additions or those changes, right? So you can do that in the text, or you can do that in the defense, right? It depends how much did you use, right? So we discussed it a little bit last week. So if you reuse somebody else's definition, but you said it was insufficient, I had to add those extra 2 points, then you should say, my definition is based on this with those extensions or those modifications, right? If you synthesize your definition based on like 5 different definitions, but
like I've been reading about this
mm-hmm.
in general so many times that I didn't go to one definition and I didn't build my definition by rephrasing.
Mm-hmm.
I just built my definition because I read through the whole year so many times that.
Yeah. So in that case, I would say it's fine if you just have your own definition, but you have to have some rationale or some arguments of why it is a good definition. So you have to have some evaluation, right? Because if you just say, oh, I just have this definition out of the blue, right? Then the reviewer say, why didn't you use an existing definition? And then you have to say, well, because this definition had this deficiency, this definition had this, and blah, blah, blah. You have to have some sort of motivation of why your definition is better than existing ones, right? If you could use existing ones, use existing one. But if you introduce something new, or if you just synthesize in your head from various places by reading a lot about it, that's fine. That's perfect. That's what That's what we do, right? That's the contribution, right? You've sort of thought about it, you synthesized it, and somehow it happened in your head that that's a kind of a good, well-fitting definition. You just have to have some evaluation of why it is a good definition, right? And why you couldn't use an existing one. Yeah, that's fine. You can also made up a definition just for the sake of arguing in the particular train of thought, right? So we could say, for the sake of discussing it, we define object orientation as this, and then you set up some properties. And they may or may not be what the mainstream thinks, or they may or may not be what is really considered all, but for the rest, it would be your definition that is used, right? It will become like an assumption. So under those assumptions, the rest holds, right? And that's fine as well. So you can kind of, yeah, you shouldn't abuse it. Like, you should not redefine the whole, universe just for the sake of arguing your thesis in your master project. But sometimes it's good to, because, for example, public key infrastructure is kind of a very general term, right? It can mean different things to different people. And sometimes you want to constrain it. You want to say, I'm only interested in those aspects. The other aspects, okay, they are interesting, but they are beyond the scope. And according to my definition, I'm talking about this. And it's like a smaller piece, right? Same with object orientation. Object orientation can be very broad. You can do a PhD thesis on what object orientation is. But you can say, for the discussing of the differences between languages, I mean this, and it might be very small set of criteria, right? And that's fine as well. Yeah, coming back to your question before, a lot of work in blockchain technology is done this way. Like, people don't necessarily go back to all the crypto stuff and who invented what. They just come up with the new protocol saying, oh, look, we just came up with this new protocol that has those properties. It has those cool features and so on, right? And they don't go through the proper research of what has been done before and blah, 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 right? And that's fine as well. They usually, in fact, it's fine, but it kind of complicates the work, because you end up having a lot of white papers which don't cite each other, and they replicate the same things, which is based on somebody else's work nobody cites, right? And then finding that is actually quite a challenge. It's much easier if people do the proper academic thing, because then you have the tree. You have all the links already there, and you can track it. But if you have those dispersed kind of branches, then it's really hard, because the Jonathan work kind of sits somewhere, and it has some things that has been done before and some new things, right? But you don't know it, and you don't know which ones are those, because you have other kind of people's work which is completely unrelated to him, and he's not citing anything, and this has been done before, right? And how you can find it? Well, exactly, right? So you should be doing the finding, or it's his responsibility to do the finding? Well, he should be doing it, but if he's not doing it, somebody else might be doing that, and you can kind of put his work into context of other people's work, and then that will be your contribution, right?
That really depends, though. I mean, that depends on what they're trying to do. Are you trying
exactly.
to be an academic, or are you trying to get shit done?
Exactly.
I mean, if you go like, academics are held for all the algorithms that are, that people come up with.
Yes.
But it's probably nothing compared to what people do in different working environments.
That's right. So it depends. It depends what is the main purpose of the work, right? Is the main purpose of the work progressing our knowledge, or, yeah, but that's not kind of a binary either, right? By doing stuff, we also progress the knowledge, right? So as I said, this traditional separation is much more blurred these days. So there is a lot of actual knowledge generation in companies as well, right? Traditionally, they were mostly commercializing stuff that has been done elsewhere, But nowadays, like, you know, research labs in Google and in Facebook and so on, they are better than universities. There's more researchers working there and actually, you know, doing stuff than it is in academia doing stuff, right? As for like social networking and things like that. So it's, I don't know, like we are kind of living in interesting times where this is actually changing. Traditionally, it was different. You had this traditional, you know, industrial tracks, engineering, or the academic tracks. Now, it's very difficult to isolate one from the other, right? Should you be doing that? I don't know. It depends on your objectives, right? Would it be beneficial if someone took Jonathan's work and kind of mapped it to what has been done before? I think it would be beneficial. But would it make the writing games now easier? No, it wouldn't, because it's just kind of conceptual work, right? So there is this practical aspects that he's kind of focusing on, and then other people might be focusing on, right? Yeah, I don't know. It is challenging, especially in the kind of domains like ours, where the creational things of artifacts and the kind of the practice is as important as the theory, right? In social sciences, where you only study phenomena, and you cannot really directly influence things, it's a little bit different, right? Because you are all about kind of you're not creating artifacts, you're kind of investigating the reality, right? Physics is the same. Although even with physics, you have material physics and so on, and they try to come up with new things as well, right? Yeah. So it's a spectrum, right? What we want to focus is the quality, right? To improve our quality and our own reflection and our own understanding of what we are experts in and what we are not. And then you have to identify for your master project what areas that I'm not expert in, I have to become an expert in, right? And you will become an expert in a particular area better than your supervisors, because you will spend more time there, right, in that depth of that thing. It may sound kind of impossible, but like, believe me, like maybe for masters, not all of you will become better than your supervisors, but definitely for your PhD, if you were to do a PhD, you would, right? So for masters, if you do, then it's great. That means you sort of dive deep enough that you now know more than your kind of mentor or your supervisor, right? Okay. So that's it for today. I have a meeting at 11, which I'm late now.